Welcome everybody to Talks at Google. Thank you for coming. My name is Yigal, and today I'm pleased to bring in Dr. Nathalia Holt. A few words about Dr. Holt before she jumps in. Nathalia, a fellow Bostonian, is a former fellow at the Reagan Institute of Mass General Hospital, MIT, and Harvard University, the University of Southern California, and Tulane University. She is a science writer and the author of a highly acclaimed book named Cured: The People Who Defeated HIV. Today, she presents her new book, Rise of the Rocket Girls, which looks like this. Her book does a fine balancing act. On the one hand, she lays forward an untold, touching, diverse, and almost unbelievable story of female rocket science pioneers from the JPL labs in Pasadena, California. On the other hand, she captures a time very different from ours. Or is it? Let me just quote, "Motherhood, the career she was formed for, loomed large," believes one heroine. "School teacher, nurse, secretary, those were the options before her," ponders another. Well, by November 9th, 2016, the US of A may be a tiny bit different place, but for now, Dr. Nathalia Holt.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today and talk to you about Rocket Girls. I actually came across this story in a very unusual way. In 2010, my husband and I were expecting a baby, and we were having a really difficult time coming up with names. My husband finally suggested Eleanor Francis, and I wasn't sure. The name's a little old-fashioned. And so I did what parents do these days, and I Googled the name. And the person that came up was a woman named Eleanor Francis Helene. And there's this beautiful picture of her in the 1960s. She's accepting an award at NASA. And I was just shocked by this picture because I had no idea that women worked at NASA at this time, much less as scientists. And so I wanted to learn more. And what I found was that she wasn't alone. There was actually a large group of women all working at NASA. They started in the 1940s, and they were hired as computers. So before all of the digital devices we have today, a computer simply meant a person who computes. And laboratories needed to hire computers to do all the calculations in their laboratory. So these women started out at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. And this is a laboratory of misfits, really. It's a group that was started by the Suicide Squad. And so some of them were students at Caltech, some of them weren't. But they did a whole number of reckless experiments at that university. They ruined landscaping. They mixed nitrous dioxide with wood alcohol inside one of the buildings, creating a toxic gas that ended up completely rusting a brand new, expensive wind tunnel. And then finally, they blasted off the side of a building with one of their experiments. And at this point, Caltech had enough. They said, okay, you guys have to leave. So they went out to this isolated canyon in Pasadena and started doing their experiments there. And at the time, rocket science was considered a fringe science. You would never want to call yourself a rocket scientist. It just wasn't something that was respected. And there was this very pervasive feeling in the scientific community that the work they were doing would amount to nothing and that it would be impossible for a rocket to ever leave the atmosphere. So they continued their experiments, and then remarkably enough, in 1939, they got a small grant from the US government. And this was actually the first time the government was investing in rocket research. And with this money, they hired 2 computers. They hired friends of theirs, a husband and wife team named Barbie and Richard Canwright. They were both very good at math. And so altogether, the Suicide Squad started working on something called JATO, or Jet Assisted Takeoff, where they strapped rockets onto airplanes and then ignited them. And they ended up having some success here. So here's a team with one of their airplanes, and you can see Barbie on the far end. She's the one in the skirt, so pretty easy to pick out. And because of their success, they were able to get another grant, and they were using this technology now to lift bombers. So with this new grant, Richard Canwright was promoted to engineer, but Barbie was not. And this was just to be expected at the time. Women were not engineers, and she was really very happy to have her job as a computer. In the 1940s, there were so few options for women interested in math and science. And so she felt very fortunate to have this position. So with Richard promoted, the lab hired a few more computers. They hired a man and 2 women. And one of those women was named Macy Roberts. Now, Macy was a lot older than most of these young, crazy, reckless people at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And so the director ended up in 1942 making her supervisor of the computing section. And she decided that although men applied to her group, she wasn't going to hire any men. She wanted it to be all women. And so today this would be a lawsuit, of course. But back then, the idea was that she wanted to create this really cohesive family group, and she worried that if she hired men, they simply wouldn't listen to her. And so she hired a lot of women. And these women came from all different kinds of backgrounds, all different education. But what I found when I interviewed them, and many of them are still alive today, is that they all loved math. They just had a passion for it. So the education, many of them only had high school degrees, and at the time, college degrees weren't really a prerequisite, so this wasn't a big deal. But some of them did have degrees. One of those is this woman here named Janez Lawson. She was the first African American hired in a technical position at JPL, and she had a degree in chemical engineering from UCLA. So today, she would have just been hired as an engineer, but back then, she was hired as a computer. So these women all worked together. They worked mostly with paper and pencil, but they also had these really clunky Frieden calculators. And these calculators looked really complicated, but they could do very little. They could do sort of basic addition, subtraction. Later models could do square roots. And the women would have races with these calculators to see who could do the equations the fastest. But they really took a lot of pride in their work, and they felt like they were on par with the male engineers. They felt very respected in their positions, even though, of course, they were paid quite a bit less. And so the women were doing calculations for early missiles. They were working on the Corporal, the Sergeant missile. And at the lab, the feeling was that they didn't want to work on weaponry, but they had to pay the bills. But what they really wanted to do was space exploration. There simply wasn't money in that. But slowly, they started using this weaponry and twisting the calculations they had made for missiles into exploration. And so we see this on September 20th, 1956, when the women use their calculations for a big rocket. And what they end up doing is they take their calculations for the Sergeant missile, but they don't use the full missile. They take a small model of it that the women called baby sergeants, and they strap them together like this. And they put them on different stages. So they make 3 different stages strapped together with these baby sergeants. They have a big rocket on the bottom. And on September 20th, 1956, they fire this. And it's a really big, exciting moment because they have so much success here. They're able to lift off this rocket called Jupiter-C to an elevation of 3,335 miles, which is a record at the time. And although they are so excited by this, there is a bittersweet feeling too, because at the top are just sandbags. What they wanted to be doing was launching a satellite, and they could have in 1956, and it would have been the world's first satellite, but the contract had already been given to the Navy, so JPL just had to wait. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik. And you can imagine how frustrated they are at JPL. The women are just seething because they know that they could have launched a satellite a year before. But finally, when a second Sputnik is launched, enough pressure is finally put on the Eisenhower administration that they give JPL the go-ahead to do a satellite. And so they work on this. They take their baby sergeants that are all strapped together. They do the exact same setup as they had for Jupiter-C. But this time, they have Explorer-1, the first American satellite, perched at the top. And on January 31st, 1958, they launch the rocket. And in the control room that night are several women who are instrumental to the project, but probably none is more important than this woman here, Barbara Paulson. So she had already been working in the lab for a decade. She started when she was a teenager. And this night, she is the one plotting the trajectory of the satellite as it leaves Earth. And so she's sitting at the light table with her paper and pencil, doing this all by hand. And over her shoulder are Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, and the president of Caltech. And everyone in the room is just waiting for her calculations to know if this mission is going to be a success. And when she finally calculates that, yes, the satellite has made it, the first American satellite is a success, the room just erupts in celebration. It is such an exciting moment for Explorer 1. And in that moment is the birth of NASA. Nothing will be the same now. So now the women leave behind missiles, they leave behind weaponry forever, and they begin working on space exploration. And the hours change. Now they're working a lot of really long days. They frequently have to work 24 hours during a launch. They have to be there in the control room when a launch is happening. And this is all happening at the same time where they're at the age, they're getting married, they're starting families. So this is Barbara Paulson in 1958. And there was no maternity leave then. So there was really this expectation that you would have to leave your job. In 1960, only 25% of mothers worked outside the home. And so the women at JPL would hide their pregnancies as long as they could, knowing that they might never make it back. But at the same time that they're becoming families, there's another threat looming, and that are IBMs. And what I found is that at other NASA centers, when IBMs came in, the humans that worked as computers lost their jobs. And this is frankly what I expected when I first started researching this project. I figured that the women at JPL would probably end up leaving once computers came in. But this didn't happen. Instead, they kept their jobs. They were so valued, and there was so much distrust of IBMs at the time. There was a feeling that these machines were really unreliable. So it became the women who were sent to the IBM training schools. They were the ones that learned the early computing languages, and they were the ones that became the first computer programmers in the lab. So against my assumptions, the women stayed there through the decades, and it was the computers that were constantly changing around them. And one exception is this computer, an IBM 1620, that has a really special relationship with the women, and it's kind of a big part of the story in the book. The women name it Cora, and she kind of becomes a member of the women computers. She has her own little room, of course, that's air-conditioned, but they have a nameplate outside the door that has the names of all the women computers, and then Cora's at the bottom. So she's very important in all this. So while they're working on this cutting-edge technology, they're also dealing with gender norms of the day, and one of these was beauty contests. So the lab did hold these beauty contests, and the women even participated in them. Barbara Paulson was a second runner-up in Misguided Missile, and that contest was later changed to Queen of Outer Space. And these contests just seem ridiculous. But yet, what I found is that really, in a way, they highlight the progressive hiring policy of JPL. You couldn't have held a beauty contest at any other NASA center because they simply didn't hire enough women. And they were part of all of these social events the lab had that was really different at JPL than other NASA centers. There were constantly dances and groups. And what I found was that the employees spent so much time together at work and then so much time together in these social events that there were many important friendships that were forged here. And when it came time for male engineers to write up their findings and to publish, they often included their female colleagues on these publications. And this was just not done at the time. This was so unusual, and it really changed the longevity of their careers. So one of my favorite beauty contest stories is the Queen of Outer Space in 1964. And so at the time, they were working on something called the Ranger. And so these were early probes to the moon. They were trying to find a landing site that would be suitable for astronauts. And there was a lot of tension happening in the lab then, because while they had to do these moon missions, the real focus for many of the engineers and scientists at the lab were for the planets. They felt that the moon was not interesting, it wasn't scientifically important, and what they wanted to do was to get a spacecraft to Venus. And so there were actually competing missions at the time to the moon and to Venus, and much attention from moon missions ended up getting diverted to the planets. And because of this, what we see is just failure after failure of these Ranger missions to the moon. And Ranger 6 was a big moment. They're waiting for the lander to land on the moon. They're trying to see if they can pick the right landing site that can support a lander and can support astronauts in the future. And so many of NASA administrators are waiting in Washington, D.C. until they get word. And President Johnson is on the line. They're waiting for the signal to come through. And as they're waiting, they suddenly hear breaking in, "Spray on Avon and walk in fragrant beauty." And it turns out that they actually crossed feeds with the Miss Outer Space contest at JPL during this. So this is a very embarrassing moment for JPL. But even more embarrassing is the fact that Ranger 6 never makes it. It crashes. They still have another failure on their hands. And now they're really at the end. And NASA tells them, if you can't make this work, if you can't make this next mission a success, we're just going to scrap the whole thing, and you're not going to be part of this at all. And so finally, Ranger 7 lands. It is a success, and they're able to get the pictures from the Sea of Tranquility and realize that, yes, this is a perfect spot for astronauts to land. And this, of course, happens in 1969 with Apollo 11. And the women's fingerprints are all over this mission. The Saturn V rocket that started it was a big part of building on what the women did. The fuel that was in the rockets was all developed from the women's calculations. And even those first words, "one small step," was made possible because of the deep space network that the women built. So the other momentous thing that happened in 1969 was the women finally became engineers. This is a really big moment now. They're no longer computers. They've gotten a raise. They've gotten the prestige of being engineers. And one of these women is named Helen Lang. And she had an amazing career at JPL. After Macy Roberts retired, she became supervisor. And she was a big force in bringing women back after they'd had a baby. She was the one that would do the calls to women and ask if they wanted to come back to the lab. And she presented a very strong example of this herself because she, before any maternity leave, was able to sort of scrap together enough vacation time to take 6 weeks off after the birth of her second child and come back to the lab. And so it's really because of her that they created this culture of working mothers at JPL. And now by the late 60s, she's on a new mission. She's decided that she really wants to increase the number of women engineers at JPL. And the way she does this is she finds women who are very bright but don't have degrees in engineering. They have bachelor's degrees in math or in computer science. She hires them and then encourages them to go to night school. And because of this policy, which was really much like Macy Roberts of hiring as many women as she could, she was able to fill the lab with engineers. And one of those women is named Sylvia Miller. So Sylvia was hired as a computer, kind of right at the end of computers, and then went to night school for engineering. And one of the early projects she worked on in the 70s was called the Grand Tour. And this was a really exciting project to explore the solar system. But unfortunately, NASA at that time was undergoing massive budget cuts, so they slashed the project. And what Sylvia and her colleagues in this picture did is they decided that they didn't want to give up on this. So they came in one weekend and they designed this really audacious trajectory to go explore the solar system. And what they did was they figured out a way to use something called gravity assist to move from planet to planet. So they would send a spacecraft out and then use the gravitational pull of a planet to spin it around and send it off to the next planet. And they kept this all under wraps. They didn't want to tell anyone because they feared that if they told administrators what they were doing, the project would just get canceled. And so this mission eventually became Voyager. And it's because of this mission that we have all of these beautiful glimpses into the planets of our solar system. And one of the Voyagers has even left our solar system and entered interstellar space. It's the first human-made object to do so. And after working on this, Sylvia became director of the Mars Program Office. And so she worked with many of the other women who were once computers, so Barbara Paulson and Sue Finley and Helen Lang and that large group. And they sent many rovers to the Red Planet, some of which are still roaming today with all of their programs inside of them. And it really is incredible how long their careers have been. They've been 50-year careers at NASA. In 2013, I held this reunion of the women at JPL, where we brought back as many of the women as we could to the lab. And I was really shocked to find how little recognition there's been of their work. In 2008, NASA held a big gala in honor of Explorer 1, the first American satellite, but they didn't invite the women who were part of that night. Not even Barbara Paulson, who was such a critical part of that mission's success. But probably the most tragic of the stories is Sue Finley. So Sue Finley was hired in 1958 by Macy Roberts, and she is NASA's longest-serving female employee. But in 2004, NASA decided that if you don't hold a bachelor's degree, you can't be an engineer. And Sue Finley, who was hired at a time before bachelor degrees were really necessary, was then demoted. And so her engineering title was taken away, and she was put on an hourly salary. Despite this, she loves being in the lab. She's currently working on Juno, our mission to Jupiter, and it's really the only sad part for her is filling out time cards. She loves her job and her work that she's doing. So writing this book, I feel, is important for bringing recognition to these women who really deserve it, but it's also important for women in technology today. We're seeing a very sad situation where in 1984, 37% of all bachelor's degrees in computer science were conferred to women, and today that number has dropped to 18%. So my hope is that these stories can serve as an inspiration to women that are interested in pursuing these careers today. So we did name my daughter Eleanor Francis, and she is named in part for a woman that I have never met, but whose story I hope will one day inspire my daughter to do some exciting things. Thanks so much.
That's a great story, thanks. And as you implied, it's not unique. There were a lot of other organizations where the human computers, mostly women, transitioned into programming. IBM itself, for example, a lot of famous women from the sort of earlier days of programming languages and compilers and so on. But again, as you point out, that seems to be going away, going backwards. Do you have any thoughts about why or how to address that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think an interesting case is Harvey Mudd. So in 5 years, they increased the number of women graduating with degrees in computer science from 12% to, I believe, 40%. And they made a number of changes. They made changes in the structure of their introductory computer science courses. They made some other changes, offering more research opportunities and sending women to a conference on females in computer science. And I think it's probably a combination of things, but it's nice if we can look to programs like that and see the changes they're making that hopefully can inspire. I do think it's important to have role models as well. I know for myself, there's many times when I've thought, well, if Barbara Paulson did this in 1959, I'm sure that I can manage it today. So there's value to that as well.
You said a lot of these women have retired since. Do you have a sense of, have they gone on to do other things, or are they just, hanging out?
Oh, they had very long careers at JPL. I mean, they had 50-year careers. So, now they're mostly in their late 80s, early 90s. So, yeah, I mean, it's amazing how active they are. And it's incredible how vivid their memories are. I mean, I was really shocked by that, just how much detail they can remember of how missions went and what their life was like. So, yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to figure out how to use that experience to motivate other people. I guess your book is the way to do that. So.
Thanks.
This may seem like a silly question, but the women that were hired initially because they were good at math, how did they become good at math? I mean, women were actively discouraged from taking math courses. Math seems like it's a little less accessible than other subjects like maybe history or philosophy or something like that. What did they do to gain their math skills?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not always that they did that well in their classes, but they really enjoyed math. And I heard over and over again that they were the only girl in their math classes. That was certainly a common thread that went through. Most of them took as much math as they could in high school, So I think it really just comes down to their passion for the subject and their ability to pursue it. There's a few cases where even women that didn't graduate from college, such as Sue Finley, she did take some college math, and she couldn't get the math that she needed at her women's college, so she ended up going to a men's college and taking courses there. So they found a way to get it, even if it wasn't as accessible as it could have been at the time. Thank you so much for coming.